Well, let's take you live now to SABC News Correspondent Alex Cadier for the latest on the EU ceasefire meeting facilitated by Qatar. Alex, good evening. Has there been any response, or what's the latest coming out of that particular meeting?
Well, the latest we have at the moment is a variety of meetings, but particularly focusing on the latest we heard is that the CIA director has actually flown to Europe to meet with the head of the Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, and also meeting with the Prime Minister of Qatar. And obviously, Qatar have played that mediation role, looking at a way of trying to find lines of communication to Hamas, to other organizations in Gaza that are holding those Israeli hostages. The objective, the stated objective, is very clear for this meeting: to try and negotiate some kind of deal, a ceasefire, a release of those hostages, trying to find that balance. It's been since the start of the month, since the last week-long ceasefire collapsed, and the objective now appears to be, or at least to start having talks on this issue. That seems to be the priority at the moment. Now, details about what's happening inside the meeting are pretty thin on the ground, as you can imagine. When you've got the head of the CIA and the head of the Mossad, as well as the Prime Minister of Qatar in the same room, these are quite tight-lipped about what's going on. What we do know about what's happening outside, and the kind of growing pressure on Israel to find the ceasefire deal that's being put forward, both by the Biden administration and by European allies. We've seen just in the last few hours the German foreign minister co-writing a piece with the British foreign minister, both two countries that have been very supportive of Israel, both saying a sustained ceasefire is now needed. That word sustained leaving a little bit of room for Israel to have a bit of influence on the terms of that ceasefire. But certainly the fact that this meeting is happening could be a venue, could be some kind of vehicle for this pressure coming from Israel's allies towards a ceasefire. But
is this a negotiation in good faith, given Benjamin Netanyahu's statement on preventing a two-state solution, or resistance to a two-state solution? What's been said on that score?
Well, that's certainly a lot more complicated, and we've seen Israel's allies express their disappointment. We've heard from Lord Cameron, the British Foreign Minister, expressing his disappointment when the Israeli ambassador to the UK said that she was not in support of a two-state solution. Netanyahu's comments also not received particularly well in Washington, D.C., and certainly in European capitals across the European Union, and that will be a key issue. These meetings are very much in the shorter term. The priority will be the release of those hostages and a ceasefire to spare as many innocent civilian lives in Gaza as well. And so that broader conversation about what comes next, as you very rightly said, is an extremely complicated one. We know that the European Union, or the European Commission, has put forward a position that it has as to what the next day could look like. It involves no to the return of Hamas, for example, but it also means no permanent occupation of Gaza by Israel, and no forced displacement of Palestinians in Gaza as well. So these are all solutions that Israel's allies and countries that have been critical of Israel are putting forward as possible solutions for the next day. But for today, it seems the priority is very much trying to find a deal on that ceasefire and on the release of the hostages.
Given that these are happening, in some kind of order, Alex, certain priorities are on the table first. When does this meeting or this gathering come away with a consensus position? When is that expected to happen, given as well how urgent it is and how many more lives are being lost every single day?
Yeah, that urgency is very much felt when you speak to officials here in the European Union. You speak to officials from countries, particularly like Ireland, Spain and Belgium, that have really been ramping up the pressure for a ceasefire, that have expressed their frustrations even at the European Union level, saying, look, we need to be stronger on this. We need to send a clearer message. And that urgency is communicated very, very clearly by some of these countries. And that urgency, of course, is felt very profoundly, very deeply, very sadly on the ground by those on the receiving end of quite an extensive bombing campaign in Gaza, but also felt very strongly that urgency by the families of those 100-plus hostages still being held by Hamas and other groups. And so that priority will be to find some kind of deal. But of course, you have two warring sides. You have no love lost there, and certainly not a huge amount of trust, particularly because the last ceasefire already collapsed just at the start of this month. So the effort will be doubles. We've seen particularly domestic quick political pressure against the Netanyahu government, with those protesters coming out in the streets of Tel Aviv after those hostages were very tragically killed by Israeli defense forces as they were waving white flags, having, we speculate, escaped from their captors from Hamas. So that urgency, that sorrow on the ground, that human suffering on the ground, and the suffering of those families of the hostages will certainly be front of mind for those negotiators.
Alex, thank you very much for the updates. We will keep you posted via Alex on developments from those talks. Our SABC News Correspondent, Alex Cadier.